Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I knew my mom's smile was just another prelude to a backhanded insult, the same kind she'd been perfecting since I was old enough to pick out my own shoes or voice my own opinion. There was something in the way her lips curled upward, just a little too tight, just a little too forced, that always made my skin itch with anticipation, like waiting for a slap you know is coming but can't quite dodge. And yet, there I was again, standing on the threshold of the house I grew up in, clutching a bottle of wine that I knew damn well wouldn't be appreciated and a forced smile of my own, thinking maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But of course it wasn't. It never is. The door swung open before I had the chance to knock, and there she was, Carol, in all her performative cheer, wearing a Christmas sweater so aggressively festive it looked like it might start playing music on its own. "There's my little artist," she said, dragging out the word, artist, like it tasted sour in her mouth, her eyes immediately scanning me from head to toe, pausing just a beat too long on my boots as if silently calculating how much I spent and whether it was worth it. "You look comfortable," she added, and just like that, the first little cut was made. Not enough to draw blood, but sharp enough to sting. I should have known better than to let my guard down before I'd even taken off my coat. Inside, the house looked exactly the same, every decoration perfectly placed, every surface scrubbed within an inch of its life, every inch of the place reeking of cinnamon candles and overcompensation. The tree sparkled in the corner, gifts arranged in a way that screamed photo opportunity, and of course, Emily's family photo was already front and center on the mantel. It always was. There she was in her corporate glory, standing next to her husband Mark and their two children, all beaming like a stock image from a holiday catalog. My own photo wasn't there. It hadn't been for years. I stopped pretending to care around the time she started pretending not to notice. "Emily's already here," Mom said, as if that sentence was meant to carry more weight than it did, and maybe it did in her world. "She's in the kitchen helping me with the hors d'oeuvres. You know how much she loves to pitch in." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes as I followed her into the house, already bracing myself for whatever comparison was about to come next. I hadn't even made it past the entryway before I heard Emily's voice floating in from the kitchen, bright, pleasant, slightly performative, just like Mom's. She walked in a moment later, dressed like she'd stepped out of a holiday party invitation ad, makeup flawless, smile effortless. "Hannah," she said, wrapping her arms around me in a hug that was more show than substance. "You made it." Of course I made it. I always made it. I just didn't come bearing stories of stock options and corner offices, so my arrival didn't come with the same red carpet treatment. At dinner, it all unfolded exactly as I expected. The table buzzed with stories about Emily's latest promotion, vice president of marketing for some massive retail chain, something Mom couldn't stop talking about. "She's always had such a sharp mind for business," she said, beaming with pride, as if Emily had just cured cancer. "It's no wonder they keep promoting her." Then she turned to me, wine glass in hand, smile thinner than ever. "And how's your freelancing going?" she asked, dragging out the word like she wasn't quite sure it qualified as a legitimate profession. "Still writing those little articles?" Emily chuckled politely, trying to mask her amusement behind a sip of wine, but I saw it. They always thought they were so subtle, but after decades of being the family punchline, you learn to recognize every smirk, every glance, every snide undertone hidden in their compliments. "It's going well," I said, keeping my tone light, refusing to let her bait me into defending myself. "Actually just wrapped a project with a pretty major outlet." Her eyebrows raised just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, that's nice. It's good to stay busy, even if it's not stable." There it was. The backhand dressed up as encouragement. I nodded, reaching for the wine bottle and pouring myself another glass, because if I was going to sit through another night of veiled insults and exaggerated praise for my sister, I was damn sure going to do it with a steady buzz in my veins. The rest of the dinner played out like a rerun of a show I'd watched too many times. Emily talked about work trips and performance bonuses, Mom swooned, Dad occasionally grunted in agreement, and I stayed quiet on the surface. Because deep down, under every smile and every sip, I was building something. A moment. A reveal. A reckoning. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend. I was going to let them talk, let them laugh, let them build their tower of condescension just high enough so I could knock it over in one clean blow. I smiled, poured another glass of wine, and thought, this is going to be a Christmas to remember. There's something strange about success when you've spent most of your life being told you'd never amount to anything, like it grows in you differently, not as something you wear on your sleeve, but as something you keep buried deep inside, away from the people who never believed in it anyway. I never built anything to impress my family, not really, not after the first few years of trying so hard to earn a reaction that never came. Somewhere along the way, I stopped reaching for their approval and started building a life entirely outside the scope of their expectations, a life they couldn't measure in the same way they measured Emily's. And truthfully, that was the point, because I knew if they ever saw it clearly, it would dismantle the myth they'd spent decades building, the myth that Emily was the success story and I was the sentimental, wayward afterthought. What they never knew, what they still hadn't even begun to suspect, was that the little freelance writing they mocked so often had grown into something far bigger, something solid, something real. A few years ago, I co-founded a media agency with a colleague I met at a publishing conference, and together we'd built it from the ground up. No family loans, no startup fund from daddy's contacts, just raw effort, sleepless nights, and a hell of a lot of mistakes that eventually turned into mastery. We now manage digital campaigns for authors, artists, and production houses. We've placed books on bestseller lists, helped launch 3 award-winning podcasts, and just last quarter, we signed a licensing deal with a major film studio that's going to adapt one of our flagship projects into a streaming series. It still blows my mind sometimes how none of them have even the slightest clue. Not just about the agency, but about everything else I've quietly put in place while they were too busy clapping for Emily's quarterly reviews. I bought my first home 2 years ago, paid in full, no mortgage. A small but beautiful place in the hills, with wide windows and a workspace that overlooks a forest trail I walk every morning. I bought my second property last summer, a duplex I rent out, managed through a company I partially own. I've diversified investments, grown a portfolio, and have a net worth that would probably make Emily blink twice. And I've told no one. Not out of shame, but out of power. Because sometimes silence is sharper than any brag. Sometimes silence is where the real strength grows. The truth is, they never asked. They never once looked at me with genuine curiosity, never wondered what I was really doing when I wasn't at their dinner table. To them, I was just floating through life, writing quirky little essays and struggling to make rent, a tragic contrast to their golden girl. And I let them believe it. I let them build that story so high they couldn't see over it, because I knew one day, when the time was right, I wouldn't need to shout anything. I'd just need to show them the truth and let it burn through their delusions like gasoline. I remember once, when Emily was hosting some fundraiser for her company, Mom invited me along, more as a showpiece than a guest. Just come and network, she said, as if I was still looking for someone to hand me a job. I spent most of the evening listening to strangers talk about spreadsheets and market forecasts with such inflated self-importance it was hard not to laugh. Meanwhile, I was negotiating a 6-figure contract with a European distributor from my phone in the corner of the event hall, sipping bad wine while pretending I didn't belong. I realized in that moment that I didn't need to be recognized by them. I didn't need their applause. I already had something they could never take away: independence, creative freedom, financial security, and a life that was mine in every possible way. Still, that doesn't mean I didn't crave the satisfaction of exposing it all. Not for validation, but for truth. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give a person who underestimated you is not your anger or your defense. It's the unfiltered truth, laid bare and undeniable. That's why I sat at that Christmas table this year without flinching. That's why I smiled when they talked about Emily's new title, her company car, her family trip to Aspen. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that in just a few moments, I would show them what I'd built, not for their praise, not to prove anything to them, but to finally bury the tired little myth they'd been clinging to all these years. I didn't come to brag. I came to bury the myth they built about me. There's something about the ritual of exchanging gifts in my family that always felt less like an expression of love and more like a quiet competition dressed in shiny paper and satin ribbons, as though the price tag or perceived usefulness of a gift somehow reflected your worth in the family hierarchy. Over the years, I'd grown used to receiving presents that came with veiled messages stitched into the bows, cookbooks implying I should find a hobby that wasn't just writing, travel mugs suggesting I should get out more, or my personal favorite from 2 years ago, a self-help book with a sticky note on the cover that said, "Thought this might help." I knew better than to expect anything thoughtful, and yet every year I showed up, smiled politely, and opened whatever passive-aggressive token my mother had picked out, pretending I didn't feel the sting underneath the surface. This year was no different, at least not at first. The moment the wrapping paper started to tear and the room buzzed with small talk and polite laughter, I could feel the tension in my jaw start to build, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what's coming and still bracing for the hit anyway. Emily, naturally, opened her gifts first. A leather tote from Dad, monogrammed with her initials in gold embossing. A designer scarf from Mom, who practically sang about how hard she had to search to find just the right shade to match Emily's winter coat. Mark gifted her a spa retreat package with a handwritten card about how she deserved to relax after such a successful year, and the kids gave her a custom photo calendar filled with family snapshots and cute little doodles in the margins. When it was my turn, my mother handed me a neatly wrapped box with a smirk so slight you'd miss it if you weren't used to reading her face the way I've had to. I peeled back the paper slowly, and there it was, a blender. A basic, department store blender with a bright sticker still on the box boasting, "Perfect for smoothies, soups, and sauces." I waited for the punchline, knowing it was coming, and right on cue, Mom smiled and said, "Well, for when you're finally home enough to cook a decent meal. Can't live off takeout forever, right?" Emily chuckled lightly, not maliciously, just with that effortless air of superiority she'd been wearing since we were kids. I nodded, thanked her, and placed the box aside without another word. I knew they thought that was it. I knew they thought the moment had passed, that once again, I would sit there quietly, accept my place, and blend my pride into a smoothie like a good little afterthought. But I had come prepared this time, not for a fight, not for an argument, but for something far more surgical. I waited until all the gifts had been opened, until the room had settled into that comfortable post-unwrapping hum, when people were folding paper, sipping cider, and admiring their loot. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. No bow. No flashy packaging. Just a plain, cream-colored envelope with my mother's name written across the front in my neat, cursive handwriting. "One more gift," I said, holding it out. She raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, and took it with the same skepticism she always wore when I dared to offer something unexpected. She opened it slowly, unfolding the paper inside with careful fingers. At first, she didn't quite understand what she was looking at. Her eyes scanned the words, and for a moment I watched confusion flicker across her face until it clicked. The contract was printed on official letterhead, signed by both parties, and clearly marked as a confirmed production agreement. My agency had secured a project deal with a major network to produce a documentary series highlighting overlooked women who'd made significant impacts behind the scenes: writers, activists, entrepreneurs, and yes, one of the featured segments would be loosely based on my own story. The note attached to the contract explained the project had been greenlit and was scheduled to air next fall. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard in that house. It wasn't just quiet, it was stunned, heavy raw. My father leaned in, trying to read over my mother's shoulder. Emily glanced up, clearly unsettled, her fingers frozen around the ribbon she'd been playing with. Mark was the first to speak, his voice low but sincere. "Wait. This is your project?" I nodded once. "Yeah," I said simply, letting the truth hang there without embellishment. "My agency is producing it. It's already in post-production." We've been working on it for over a year. My mother blinked, her mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to find something to say that wouldn't sound small or dismissive, but she failed. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of discomfort, the realization that this wasn't just some article I'd written or a side gig she could brush off. This was real. It was substantial. It was far beyond anything she had ever imagined I was capable of. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. No quick remark. No thinly veiled insult. Just silence. And then I said, softly, guess I'm doing okay after all, huh? For a moment, everything stood still in that living room, as though the air itself had thickened under the weight of what I'd just dropped into their perfect little holiday scene. The wrapping paper scattered across the floor, the blinking lights on the tree, the half-full glasses of wine, it all faded into the background while my mother sat silently holding that contract, her eyes scanning the words again like she was hoping she'd somehow misread them the first time. But she hadn't. Every letter was sharp, every signature real, every detail clear. And for once, there was no way to minimize it, no way to reshape the truth into something more comfortable for her to swallow. I watched her face, not with malice, but with curiosity, like I was studying a painting I'd seen 100 times, but was just now noticing the cracks beneath the surface. She was trying to pull herself together, to plaster on a smile, to offer some bland remark that would let her keep the upper hand, but it wouldn't come. Because for the first time, she wasn't in control of the story. I was. And that terrified her more than anything I could have said out loud. Emily tried to recover first, reaching for her well-practiced enthusiasm like a lifeline. "Wow, that's amazing, Hannah," she said, forcing a smile so brittle I could practically hear it cracking. "A documentary, that's really something." But there was no sparkle in her voice, no genuine warmth in her eyes. It was all performance, hollow and flat, the kind of reaction you give when you know you've been outshined and don't know how to hide it. She glanced at Mark as if looking for backup, but he was too busy reading the contract himself, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to genuine interest. "So this is airing nationally?" he asked, tapping the corner of the page. "I've heard of this network. It's a big deal. How did you even land this kind of deal?" His tone wasn't condescending, not even skeptical. It was real, honest intrigue, the kind I hadn't heard from anyone in that house in years. "I didn't land it," I said calmly. "I built it. From the ground up." The agency pitched the concept, produced the pilot, negotiated the terms. It's been a hell of a process, but we're proud of how it turned out. Doug, who'd been unusually quiet the entire evening as always, finally spoke up, his voice low and rough from years of disuse in emotional conversations. "That's impressive, kid," he said, nodding slowly. "Really proud of you." And maybe that was the strangest part of the night, that the man who had never once said those words to me when they actually would have mattered somehow managed to find them now. It didn't change anything. Not really, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't land somewhere deep inside me, like a small stone tossed into still water, sending ripples through places I didn't know still cared. But even as they clapped politely and offered thin smiles and lukewarm praise, I saw it, the crack behind my mother's eyes. She wasn't proud. She was threatened. She was trying to keep herself upright while her carefully crafted narrative collapsed in real time around her. Because if I wasn't the disappointment, if I wasn't the one they could quietly pity at holidays and use as contrast to make Emily shine brighter, then who was I? I was the truth they had been pretending didn't exist, the version of success that didn't come with a corner office or a company handbook, but carried far more weight than they ever imagined. And worse than that, I had done it without them, without their money, without their approval, without their applause. Mom handed the envelope back to me with a tight smile and said, "Well, that's certainly unexpected. But I suppose good for you." That was it. No hug, no genuine praise, no warmth. Just another backhanded remark wrapped in civility. Emily kept her face composed, but her silence was louder than any compliment she could have offered. Mark asked a few more questions, genuinely interested, and Doug poured himself another drink, Maybe to distract himself, or maybe just to sit with the reality that the daughter they'd sidelined for decades had just changed the shape of the room without raising her voice. I sat back in my chair, watching it all unfold like a scene from a movie I'd already seen 100 times, except this time the script had changed. This time, I wasn't the supporting character in Emily's spotlight. I was the one who shifted the energy without asking for permission. I didn't need their validation anymore, but I saw how desperately they needed to believe I still did. And that made all the difference. Because no matter how many polite claps they offered, no matter how many glasses they raised in forced celebration, nothing could cover up what had just happened. I had dismantled their favorite illusion, and there was no putting it back together now. The night air was colder than I expected as I stepped out of the house and into the quiet stillness that wrapped around the front yard like a heavy coat I hadn't asked for. I didn't say goodbye to anyone when I left. I just picked up my bag, slipped on my jacket, and walked out the front door with that same steady, deliberate calm I'd been carrying all night. It wasn't anger propelling me forward, and it wasn't triumph either. It was something quieter, heavier, something that didn't come with a name, but settled deep in my chest like a truth I had finally stopped trying to ignore. I sat in my car for a few minutes before even turning the engine on, just staring through the windshield at the house I'd grown up in, watching the soft glow of the living room lights flicker behind the frosted windows. Inside, I imagined the cleanup had already begun, wrapping paper gathered, wine glasses rinsed, forced conversation filling the space where my presence had once lingered like a stubborn echo. I wondered what they were saying about me now, wondered if Mom was still holding that envelope in her lap, pretending it hadn't rattled her as much as it clearly had. Maybe she was already rewriting the story in her mind, already searching for some angle, some dismissive explanation that would keep her from admitting what was obvious, that I had built something real, something she never saw coming, and that it mattered whether she liked it or not. I pulled out my phone and sent Rachel a message with just 2 words, "It's done." And it was, in every possible way. The reveal had been made, the illusion shattered, and the weight I'd been dragging behind me for years suddenly felt just a little bit lighter. But as I stared at the screen, waiting for her inevitable explosion of exclamation points and celebratory emojis, I realized something that surprised even me. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of final glory washing over me. There was just stillness, an eerie kind of calm that didn't feel like a victory parade, but more like the quiet after a storm that left everything damp and unsettled. Rachel's reply came quickly. "Holy shit. How did it go?" I stared at the message for a while before typing out a response that I knew wouldn't capture everything I was feeling. They didn't know how to react. It landed. That's all I said, because I didn't want to unpack it yet, not with her, not even with myself. Because the truth was, I didn't really know how to feel. I had spent years waiting for this moment, fantasizing about the stunned expressions, the awkward silences, the sudden shift in power. I had dreamed about it like it was some finish line, some final scene in a movie where I got to walk away in slow motion with triumphant music playing behind me. But now that it had happened, I didn't feel like a conqueror. I felt like a woman who had just cleaned a wound that had been festering for years and was now left staring at the scar it left behind. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message I didn't expect to see, not tonight, not after everything. It was from my mother. Just a single sentence, but every word carried more weight than the paper that held my contract earlier that evening. "Still doesn't make you better than Emily." That was it. No punctuation, no warmth, no context, just another cold jab thrown from the shadows, another attempt to reduce me back to the role she was comfortable keeping me in. I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. Of course she couldn't let me have the last word. Not really. Of course she had to remind me that, in her eyes, my success was still not quite enough. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then deleted it without responding. Not out of spite, not even out of anger, but because I finally understood something I probably should have realized a long time ago. Her approval was never going to come, not in the form I wanted, not in a way that would ever feel real. And maybe the problem wasn't that I hadn't earned it, but that I had spent too many years believing it was something I needed in the first place. As I started the engine and backed out of the driveway, I felt something shift inside me, not a burst of pride or joy, but something more meaningful. It was release. It was acceptance. It was the knowledge that I didn't have to keep chasing something that was never meant for me, that I didn't have to keep trying to rewrite a story that was never mine to control. I didn't win because I proved them wrong, I won because I stopped letting their version of me define my worth. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real victory. I drove away without looking back, letting the silence of the night wrap around me like a final goodbye, not to a family, but to an identity I had outgrown. Sometimes silence isn't defeat, it's the sound of a door closing behind you for good.